I am Gwen Bird, Dean of Libraries at Simon Fraser University, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here to the second installment of our One Book, One SFU initiative. And I have to say, it's a great-looking group out there tonight. This series started in November 2015 when we welcomed Teju Cole and Eleanor Wachtel to this stage. And tonight, we're delighted to welcome two brilliant writers, Maggie Nelson and Amber Dawn, who will take the stage in just a moment. I want to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered here on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Their territories were never ceded through treaty or any other means, and it is our privilege to be gathered here tonight and to live and work on this land. The SFU Library has worked with many partners and volunteers to make this event possible this evening, and I'd like to take a moment to extend my thanks to them. First to Am Johal and his wonderful team at the Van City Office of Community Engagement at SFU Woodwards, to the UBC Creative Writing Program for their support and partnership, to Chris Brayshot, Pulp Fiction Books, who will be selling books by both Maggie Nelson and Amber Dawn at the conclusion of the event. I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with Pulp Fiction, Vancouver's legendary independent bookstore. I want to thank all the staff and volunteers who have helped out with the production of this event. And I'd like to extend special thanks to Baharak Yosefi, Head of Library Communications. She masterminded this evening's event, and she pitched the One Book, One SFU idea for us in the first place. And I'll just say what a pleasure it is to work with such creative, passionate, and talented people. I have a couple of housekeeping items. Our event this evening is being filmed and photographed, and if you don't wish to have your photo taken, please see one of the staff members to assist you, and we'll make sure that you're not on camera. There are all-gender bathrooms available on the third floor, this main level, and I'd like to ask you to turn your cell phones off before we begin if you haven't already done so. And now it is my honor to introduce Amber Dawn. She is a writer living on unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Her memoir, How Poetry Saved My Life, a Hustler's Memoir, won the 2013 Vancouver Book Award. She is the author of the Lambda Award-winning novel Sub Rosa, and she is editor of the anthologies Fist of the Spider Woman, Fear and Queer Desire, and With a Rough Tongue. Her newest book, Where the Words End and My Body Begins, is a collection of Glausa form poems. She currently teaches creative writing at Douglas College and at the University of British Columbia, as well as acting as a volunteer mentor at several community-driven art and healing spaces. Please join me welcoming Amber Dawn.
It is profoundly apt that the Argonauts was chosen for this year's One Book, One SFU. In reading the Argonauts, Maggie Nelson perhaps invites us to read more than one book. It is a book that allows us to witness the many miracles of everyday domestic love and family and placemaking. The Argonauts also examines over 30 years of feminist and queer texts from scholar Eve Shedwick to sex ecologist Annie Sprinkle. It is a book that coincides and speaks to queer and trans visibility within the mainstream, in particular California's Proposition 8 ballad, and the growing yet frequently reductive appearance of trans representation in popular media. The Argonauts observes queer ideas and aesthetics that have never been and will never be mainstreamed. like Burns and Steiner's Art Porn Community Action Center, and by hook or by crook, arguably the first trans narrative film written and directed by trans filmmakers, those filmmakers being Silas Howard and Nelson's own partner, Harry Dodge. The Argonauts becomes more than one book with each new reader. So yes, my dear audience, The Argonauts should become something unique to you if you apply its complexities to your own remarkable lives. Please allow me one more comment about The Argonauts before I invite Maggie Nelson up. The Argonauts is by no means cumulative. However lauded it is in its reception, it is not the apex of Nelson's auto theory, her combination of autobiography and critical theory. Rather, this book continues the Nelsonian approach to meaning and craft, an ever-growing body of work that performs a slippery and nimble, otter-like movement between the experiential and the theoretical. And to better understand what I mean by a Nelsonian approach, I encourage you to read her other 9 books, 4 of poetry and 5 nonfiction titles, and to further engage in this vital and multifarious dialogue that Nelson offers us. Tonight, the dialogue is going to unfold like this, as a reading of The Argonauts followed by a artist in conversation style Q&A with brief time at the end for questions from you, the audience, followed by a book signing at the end. Please welcome Maggie Nelson.
You guys, did you notice that Amber is wearing colors that match this book intentionally? It's amazing, right? And with lipstick that exactly matches the jacket. It's just amazing. So maybe I've kind of, well, I'm blurring black. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for making this possible. I'm so glad to be here. It's been a long time since I've been to Vancouver, and I'm just thrilled. And I can't wait to talk to you guys and talk to Amber, so I'll make the reading part of this fairly brief. And it's really nice to have left the United States for the night. I feel like I'm getting some years back on my life. So I'm just going to read a teeny little blip of this book, which I won't really introduce at all, and then we'll just move on. So, but this is right from smack in the middle of the book, and which doesn't really move. It has a general time narrative from about 2007 to 2013, and this is in 2011, so kind of in the middle of that. 2011, the summer of our changing bodies. Me, 4 months pregnant, you, 6 months on tea. We pitched out in our inscrutable hormonal soup for Fort Lauderdale to stay for a week at the beachside Sheraton in monsoon season so that you could have top surgery by a good surgeon and recover. Less than 24 hours after we arrived, they were snapping a sterile green hat on your head, a party hat, the nice nurse said, and wheeling you away. While you were under the knife, I drank gritty hot chocolate in the waiting room and watched Diana Nyad try to swim from Florida to Cuba. She didn't make it that time, even in her shark cage. But you did. You emerged 4 hours later, hilariously zonked from the drugs, trying in vain to play the host while slipping in and out of consciousness. Your whole torso more tightly bound than you've ever managed yourself. A drain hanging off each side, 2 pouches that filled up over and over again with blood stuff the color of red Kool-Aid. To save money over the week, we cooked our food in the hotel bathroom on a hot plate. One day we drove to a sports chalet and bought a little tent to set up on the beach because the beachside cabanas cost too much money to rent. While you slept, I ambled down to the beach and set up the tent and then tried to read Eve Sedgwick's A Dialogue on Love inside. But it was like a nylon sweat lodge in there, and neither I nor the 4-month-old fetus could tolerate it. I had started showing, which was delightful. Maybe there would be a baby. One night we splurged in our sober way and had $8 virgin strawberry daiquiris at the infinity pool, which was stocked with Europeans on cheap vacation packages. The air was hot and lavender with a night storm coming in. There was always a night storm coming in. Frat brothers and sorority sisters thronged every fried fish joint on the boardwalk. Their crowds were loud and repulsive and a little scary, but we were protected by our force field. On our third day, we drove to the second largest mall in the world and walked for hours, even though I was dizzy and exhausted from early pregnancy and the suffocating heat, and you were just barely over the lip of your Vicodin. At the mall, I went into motherhood maternity and tried on clothes with one of those gelatin strap-on bellies they have, so you can see what you'll look like as you grow big. Wearing the strap-on belly, I tried on a fuzzy white wool sweater with a bow at the sternum, the kind that makes your baby look like a present. I bought the sweater and ended up wearing it back at home all winter. You bought some loungy Adidas pants that look hot on you. Over and over again, we emptied your drains into little Dixie cups and flushed the blood stuff down the hotel toilet. I've never loved you more than I did then, with your Kool-Aid drains, your bravery in going under the knife to live a better life, a life of wind on skin, your nodding off while propped up on a throne of hotel pillows so as not to disturb your stitches. The King's Sleep, we called it, in homage to our first pay-per-view purchase of the week, The King's Speech. Later, from our Sheridan Sweet Sleeper bed, that's all caps with a TM sign around the sleeper, we ordered X-Men First Class. Afterward, we debated assimilation versus revolution. I'm no cheerleader for assimilation per se, but in the movie, the assimilationists were advocating nonviolence and identification with the other in that bastardized Buddhist way that gets me every time. You expressed sympathy for the revolutionaries who argued, stay freaky and blow them up before they come for you, because no matter what they say, the truth is they want you dead, and you're fooling yourself if you ever think otherwise. Professor, I can't stop thinking about the others out there, all those minds I touched. I could feel them, their isolation, their hopes, their dreams. I tell you, we could start something incredible. Eric, we can help them. Eric, can we? Identification, that's how it starts, and it ends with being rounded up, experimented on, and eliminated. Professor, listen to me carefully. My friend, killing Shaw will not bring you peace. Eric, peace was never an option. And so we bantered good-naturedly, yet somehow allowed ourselves to get polarized into a needless binary. That is what we both hate about fiction, or at least crappy fiction. It purports to provide occasions for thinking through complex issues, but really, it has predetermined the positions, stuffed a narrative full of false choices, and hooked you on them, rendering you less able to see out, to get out. While we talked, we said words like nonviolence, assimilation, threats to survival, preserving the radical. But when I think back on it now, I only hear the background buzz of our trying to explain something to each other, to ourselves, about our lived experiences thus far on this peeled, endangered planet. As is so often the case, the intensity of our need to be understood distorted our positions and backed us further into the cage. Do you want to be right or do you want to connect? Ask couples therapists everywhere. Deleuze, Parnay say the aim is not to answer questions, it's to get out of it. Flipping channels on a different day, we landed on a reality TV show featuring a breast cancer patient recovering from a double mastectomy. It was uncanny to watch her performing the same actions we were now performing, emptying her drains, waiting patiently for her unbinding, but with opposite emotions. You felt unburdened and euphoric, reborn. The woman on TV feared, wept, and grieved. Our last night at the Sheridan, we have dinner at the astoundingly overpriced, quote, casual Mexican restaurant on the premises, Dos Caminos. You pass as a guy, I as pregnant. Our waiter cheerfully tells us about his family and expresses delight in ours. On the surface, it may have seemed as though your body was becoming more and more male, mine more and more female, but that is not how it felt on the inside. On the inside, we were two human animals undergoing transformations beside each other, bearing each other loose witness. In other words, we were aging. And just because Amber had mentioned that we might talk about this, I'm going to read one more paragraph on a different account here. Okay. Many women describe the feeling of having a baby come out of their vaginas as taking the biggest shit of their lives. This isn't really a metaphor. The anal cavity and the vaginal canal lean on each other. They, too, are the sex which is not one. Constipation is one of pregnancy's principal features. The growing baby literally deforms and squeezes the lower intestines, changing the shape, flow, and plausibility of one's feces. In late pregnancy, I was amazed to find that my shit, when it would finally emerge, had been deformed into Christmas tree ornament-type balls. Then, all through my labor, I could not shit at all, and it was keenly clear to me that letting go of the shit would mean the total disintegration of my perineum, anus, and vagina all at once. I also knew that if or when I could let go of the shit, the baby would probably come out. But to do so would mean falling forever and going to pieces. In perusing the Q&A sections of pregnancy magazines at my OBGYN's office before giving birth, I learned that a surprising number of women have a related but distinct concern about shit in labor. Either that or the magazine editors are making it up as a kind of projective propaganda. Question: if my husband watches me labor, how will he ever find me sexy again, now that he has seen me involuntarily defecate and my vagina accommodate a baby's head? This question confused me. Its description of labor did not strike me as exceedingly distinct from what happens during sex, or at least some sex, or at least much of the sex I'd heretofore taken to be good. No one asked, how does one submit to falling forever, to going to pieces? A question from the inside. I think that's all I'll read. Thank you.
Do you feel loved and ready?
I feel good.
Okay. I'll take it.
Okay.
So, in The Guardian, a quote of which appears in this event, Olivia Lang comments on how the words "I love you" appear in your opening paragraph. I would like to comment on how ass fucking also appears in your opening paragraph. Perhaps no other act has been symbolically used to vilify queers than ass fucking has. It is literally causes mainstream moral panic. It's a normative disruption. So in placing "I love you" and ass fucking together in your opening, were you setting a kind of intention for yourself and for the readers?
I love that opening question. That's probably why I wanted to do this event, because I was like, this is gonna be much more fun than most of anything I've done. This book has been such a wild trip because of all the books I've written, when I was editing it, like editing the order, when I decided on that paragraph coming first, which was kind of an accident because I was shuffling the book a lot and I had an editor who was like, why don't you just start with the earliest temporal thing first? So I kind of culled through it, and the first passage that said 2007 was that opening paragraph. So I put it at the front, and as soon as I did, I thought, this is perfect, I love it. And then I thought, well, that'll really, I was like, all prizes are off or something, And it was really weird because, all through writing it and then all through editing it and all through all the decisions I made, I always do this, so this is not a new thing, but, every decision was, for what I thought I needed, the book needed, maybe, I don't know if I care about what the world needs or doesn't need, but I wouldn't aggrandize that far, but just kind of like what needed to happen, and that all needed to happen in the first paragraph, but it really, it was really shocking to me that the book was able to take such a, just that, if like a one book thing, or like there are colleges who've read the book, like not the whole college, but like the first class or whatever, but just kind of like, things I just thought that I was kind of making, ethically and aesthetically good choices, but that would wall it off from certain audiences, and it's been amazing that didn't happen,
Talk more about sequencing the paragraphs for the entire book. So you've untethered yourself from chronological time, although I know you did keep a record of when different passages and different paragraphs were written. But when it was time to put this book together as a whole, how did you decide where to put the anecdotes, where to put the ideas, and were you trying to ultimately lead the reader someplace through a certain trajectory of thought?
Yeah, this project, a lot of books of mine, most of them have posed structural challenge, kind of forcing some kind of invention upon like what I'm doing. And in this case, the other book, I wrote a book called Bluettes about the color blue that was in chunks. And this book, to me, was kind of in chunks. But the problem with this book was that the chunks I'd written, unlike Bluettes, where each one was, I would say, the longest was maybe a page, and the shortest was maybe a sentence. But these chunks sometimes would be like an anecdote that would be like 3 or 4 pages or something. And I didn't, so the movable pieces were clunkier. And also thematically, it was, how do I say it? Like, it was a book where there was this kind of discussion of queerness, whatever that meant in the moment I was writing, and then also this stuff about maternity. And when it became clear that the book's kind of raison d'etre, in a way, was putting them together, I had written a lot of pieces of the book, not thinking they were 2 different projects entirely, but that some of it was written for a long talk I gave on Eve Sedgwick, who had been a teacher of mine in graduate school, and who, if you read the book, I love her work very dearly. And some of it was written for a zine my friend A.L. Steiner, who's a great artist, was making for an art show of hers called Puppies and Babies, and some of it was written as just kind of more diaristic writing about taking care of a newborn and telling a birth story. So it was just like it was clunky, but like I said, it was when you ask about putting it together, it was. I mean, I think this is, even though there's a lot of content to talk about, I think essentially I'm kind of a formalist in a way, in that like the interesting questions to me are like, how does the structure of the book and how the journey goes through, how does that make its own form of argument about why queerness and maternity belong together, if I'm making sense, So they kind of have to be doing it. It has to be doing it, not just saying it,
So yeah, I knew
Which
I'd
is,
have
I
a
guess,
lot to think about.
Which is, I guess, kind of the difference between, like, I mean, I've done more academic writing or other things, but to me, I don't really like what is creative writing? What is creative? Like, whatever. What's that word? So weird. But to me, what's creative, it's not whether it's critical or whether it quotes people or any of that. It's about whether or not you're kind of using a received form, like this is what an academic paper sounds like, versus kind of trying to read it back to yourself and be like, it's like a different sense in my body anyway, where I'm kind of trying to feel what like I've made together, and that requires a lot of, putting work away, bringing it out 2 days later with a lot of coffee, and like using yourself as like a guinea pig of just like, what, is this, symphony like a bunch of, people like, whatever, like people hitting bad gongs, or is it like, am I making it come to music, and it's a hard process to describe,
I'm going to skip ahead a few questions because that was interesting, and this question might probe a bit more of that. So during an interview with Lisa Newsom for the Nonfiction Now conference, you talked about this chicken or an egg idea of how self is made or how self moves while writing. And to quote you, don't quote me, to quote you, does writing happen to me or do I happen to my writing? I've certainly thought about this as well, especially after during and after my memoir. Am I crafting this memoir? Is this memoir starting to craft me and how I am perceiving my lived experience? So how's that chicken or an egg question unfolding for you? How did it unfold during the writing of the Argonauts? And then also since it's been received and people have responded.
Do you mean kind of in a psychological way about like the formation of self, or do you mean more like where does the writing come from, or both? You know what I mean?
I kind of meant the where does the writing come from, but as soon as you said a psychological approach to self, I'm not going to stop you from from maybe entertaining that as a question as well.
Well, it's a post-structuralist dictum, right? That discourse, creates bodies or whatever. That kind of faith. And I don't. I think I've I've worried over that issue in different, kind of in different genres of worrying. Like in Bluets, have kind of a long passage about using words to remember experience, being kind of like putting scrapbooks in a photo album, where you just, after you've written about the thing, you just remember, the version of it that you wrote down, and you don't remember all the other parts that fall away. And I mean, I think in that way I was writing and in quoting Platonic dialogue about it being actually a kind of form of violence that some people feel like language does unto experience. And that concern persists in the Argonauts, which opens with my partner Harry and I having this, non-internecine fight about whether or not language is good enough, and my kind of Wittgensteinian insistence that you don't have to worry about that which falls away from language, because it'll always be there within language. It just won't be, it's contained by it, even if it's inexpressible. And his kind of deep concern over the inexpressible, and if you're poetry, if you come from poetry, there's kind of an expression like, F the ineffable, like kind of like, fuck the whole tradition that's like, whoa, if I could only speak, well, speak, let's hear what you have to say. So I think, I'm kind of a speak person and more of an F the ineffable, but I do think that writing, my experience has been in writing about either critical issues or about autobiography is that my thinking and my self-making is changed by the writing, sometimes in good ways, mostly in good, I would say, not like self-bettering, but I would say just burning out questions or obsessions that need airing out. And then sometimes I think it works in the ways I was describing in Bluets, where I do, I do think that, this is a very slim book, and even though people will say to me, like, don't you feel like you let it all hang out there? It's like I'm much more concerned that I make sure I remember the vast multitudes of things that were not put into these pages, than what I get down. That was a rambling answer to all that, but yeah.
We're here to listen to
we're
you
here to ramble.
ramble. Yeah, that's 300 plus of us are here for any ramblings you have. Thank you. In the last 15 pages, Harry's name appears as grayscale text in the margins, just as the other quote-unquote many gendered mothers of your heart are cited. And in Harry's italicized passage, he recalls the death of his mother. His witnessing is told in a poetic voice that's very characteristic of Harry Dodge, or how I know Harry Dodge, the artist. So my first thought when reading was, this death is beautiful. And then my next thought was, hey, is this the first time death is described in a queer book? I've grown really accustomed to trauma and violence being central to queer narratives. And I think for those of us that are voracious queer readers, our intersectional readers, we see Indigenous narratives, queer narratives written by Black and brown queers, trans narratives, all bringing us very close to some kind of trauma. Lucia Clifton is one of the poets that you mentioned in the Argonauts, and she was a Black lesbian poet who grew up in Buffalo, New York in the 1940s, who's probably most famously known for one of her lines of poetry that says, "Won't you celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed." So you certainly don't avoid trauma and knowing your body of work. You don't avoid or dilute these realities. But in the Argonauts, you employ what looks to me such a careful hand, and dare I say such a beautiful and nuanced hand with these themes. Talk about intention, and then also, if you can, talk about how the book has been received within queer and trans communities.
Wow, that was a lot. So interesting. It's just really interesting to think about different formations of different representations of trauma. And I don't know. I don't want to get into, not to get into this territory, but I was just, there was this kind of conflict at Reed recently, where Kim Pierce went and showed Boys Don't Cry, and was met with a lot of protests. And it was really interesting to me, not to get into the nitty gritty of kind of some of the crap that went down, but more this kind of ongoing question, which has preoccupied me for a lot of my writing life, for 3 books in particular, a book called Jane and Murder, a book called The Red Parts, and a book called The Art of Cruelty, where all of them were really perplexed about, the kind of wild ethics, kind of wild rodeo of ethics of representing violence in art and text, and the ways in which, best intentions kind of mean nothing in the face of such difficult material, and that for some people, and I really believe this, that for some people, it's healing and progressive to not see narratives that go into the heart of traumas, or that redo the trauma of watching people be killed over and over again, such as Brandon Teena and Boys Don't Cry. But I think for some people, and I would put myself more in this category, not what I want to see with other people's work, but just in my own work in life. There are certain things I've needed to revisit fairly obsessively, and we were talking in the so-called green room prior, but about even the title of The Red Parts of a book of mine was really about, I'm sorry, I'm just delving super dark, but just getting into the actual wounds of my aunt's, gunshots and death, and visually, because that book was a memoir that had a lot to do with having to see on a screen, about half that size, but a large screen represent a real trauma. So I think I've been really interested in those kind of issues for a long time, but this is all a long lead up to say that The Argonauts was I was really committed to trying to write a book about happiness, and I really wanted this book of The Color Blue to be about beauty, and it ended up being about pain, which is fine, but it was about beauty and pain. I think it's a beautiful book about pain. But, I have a friend, Michael Snedeker, who wrote a book called Queer Optimism, and it was kind of inevitable, right? You've got years of queer failure, then someone's going to write queer optimism. It's we just kind of go in these, I don't think whether it's Afro-pessimism or, queer pessimism or optimism or, failure, I think it's asinine to imagine, are you in the failure or the optimism camp? We're all doing work that needs to be done, every angle needs to be approached. But the way that things go in life, there can often be maybe it's kind of an academic thing, but there often are trends or whatever, But I did feel for me personally, I was interested in Sarah Ahmed's work on happiness, and I was interested in Michael's book about optimism, and I was interested in my own difficulty in bearing witness to happiness, because I tend to believe in a kind of Buddhist sense that if you don't stop and notice when you feel happy, it's a very evanescent, and it really might slip you right by. So in a way, I was kind of trying to do a writing practice where I, it's not an all happy book or something, but unlike the death scenes, say, in The Red Parts or something, Harry's description of his mother's death that you mentioned is very beautiful, and I think encapsulates the horror and the astonishment of watching somebody pass from this world and all we don't know about that. And I think that, the birth story that's also in the book, which is juxtaposed textually with Phyllis, Harry's mother's death, I think, I was also trying to. It was another. I'm sorry. You're just going to walk away from it. We're Maggie Nelson came and all she said was birth and death were, beautiful and horrible. Big deal. We know that, right? But there's something about the holding that experience of a thing where so many people who read that birth scene said, God, I'm so sorry. That sounds so awful. And I'm that was a good birth story. I felt smug putting that story in because all the rest of my friends were hospitalized for days or their uteruses involuted. Terrible things. And I was this worked out. Thumbs up. But nonetheless, also the most also face to face with death for sure, So I think it was really kind of an exercise. The whole book was in trying to, hold that kind of a ball up, but with a light on it that was a light that was interested in queer optimism or happiness, because it was also just a challenge. Like, happiness is boring. People get, like, I read online, someone on Goodreads said, like, you know, I just hate her face and I hope her partner dumps her. You know, just kind of like, it can make, I think, I mean, that could be for other reasons, but like, I think there's something about it. The difficulty as a writer in trying to do that is that it's not a feeling that easily shares. So I think it was really interesting for me, just as like an aesthetic challenge, to wonder how I would do it, you know.
I thank you for it. And I distrust quote unquote queer happiness. You know, I have come to think that queers get to be happy when they're selling real estate in advertising or something like that, or they're on a campaign for something at a government level to move forward. And I sincerely felt happiness and optimism, and that happiness to me became like a disruption within a disruption. Like, a queer narrative to me is still a disruption, and to come away at the end of the book and feel like there is more possibility, more freedom, more joy. I thank you for doing that.
Right on, thank you.
Okay, I'll ask you even a more uplifting question, perhaps. So, Argonauts hails the mentors, Christina Crosby, Sedgwick, and again, the many gendered mothers of your heart. And you're now a mentor. You teach, and you have certainly become perhaps a celebrity, but at least a very influential among a growing number of writers. How's it feel to arrive as a mentor yourself? And is it shaping your writing, your idea formation? How do you approach your current work?
That's such an interesting question. I don't think about it really. I mean, I think it's one of those things that, like, you never really, you know, once a student, always a student. Like, I know that I am that, and I do, you know, I've taught, gosh, I always remember, I think 1999 was my first year teaching, so that's a while, you know, moving on to, oh my God, like moving towards 20 years or something. So certainly it's a big part of my life, and I like it. I think the reason why I say I don't really think about it much is that I don't think that I think, I mean, this is kind of why some people have said to me, you know, not many people have said this, maybe one, but like have said, you know, it's weird how, like, you keep talking about the bodies of these female mentors and like how they looked coming into class, or what they, you know, all these different things. And I'm like, well, A, you know, welcome to the erotics of pedagogy, one, and then B, you know, but B, I feel like what I guess I was partly getting at was like, and this is why, I'm sorry, I'm taking a long time. Like, the reason why it's a blind spot is because people also transmit by just being who they are, you know? And so you get one thing from them when you're reading them at home. I mean, Eve Sedgwick was a really great example of this, because and she's passed, so I can say what I want. Like, she was, you know, somebody who I had one very definite relationship with on the page. You know, she wrote very, you know, dense, long, beautiful, kind of Henry Jamesian academic sentences, all this stuff. And then, you know, in person, does anyone meet Eve? Does any of you guys know Eve? I know, but like, you know, in person, she was very, you can watch on YouTube, but like, you know, she was very halting and had a really high voice, and, you know, but was like amazingly, like, you kind of had to take really long pauses and then would just say the most incisive things you'd ever heard in your life, but kind of Cohen-like. I mean, it was just really different, you know what I mean? And it was everything all together, and it was when near the end of her life, or she, you know, was kind of in and out of breast cancer treatment for many years, maybe more than a decade, I think, actually, before she died. And she was very into Buddhism and textiles, and took many trips to Tibet and wrote about the Tibetan Book of the Dying and about American Buddhist co-optations and traditions and different things. But, you know, she was always draped in textiles, and, you know, I mean, it was like a whole, you know, you get from people, it's like a whole thing that's coming at you, you know. And because we're gratefully, I think we don't know what we are, you know, like, I don't know what I'm transmitting to you per se, or I just choose not to think too hard about it. You just like make sure your flies up and, get shit off your teeth, and then you just go. Like, I think it's like, I guess it's just, to me, you just do, and you meet great students who are essentially fellow interlocutors along the way, and very quickly they become peers. I teach graduate school, and they're kind of peers there, and then as soon as they're graduated, they're, usually they come in their 20s or 30s anyway, so.
We have arrived at that time where we can take questions from the audience, so I'm going to have the wonderful Cameron in the booth raise the house lights just a little bit. We have 2 mic runners who I am certain will identify themselves. Here they are. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand, and we will do the best to get to as many of them as possible.
And is this working? Yes?
I can hear you.
Excellent.
Hello. Hi. I guess, I don't know if I'm going to phrase this very well, but what I really like in your writing is kind of this rejection of really easy binaries and kind of the freedom and sense of possibility that you can get when you transcend them. And I guess I'm just struggling to reconcile that with this era we're in where you kind of are forced to take a side, like Trump or climate change or the rise of racism. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I was just saying to Amber, I'm doing an event with Judith Butler on Monday, which is really exciting to me, and I was reading some things online, and I was reading this crazy article. If anything has American in the title, like American Thinker, American Federalist, like, don't click on it. Like, it's not, good things aren't going to happen. But it was really funny because I clicked on it. Why am I even going into this? I hope this isn't like. Anyway, it was basically saying, it was some right-wing thinker saying, like, how ironic, isn't it, for somebody who deconstructed the gender binary? She thinks that there's a side to take between Israel and Palestine, like between Zionism and Palestinian, like autonomy. And I was like, what kind of dense world is it where like, like, what do you mean? Like, you're against any binary, like you're against any side, like you're against any position? Like, it's not, like, that's just, it's like nonsensical. So I think it's so, I think we have to be, we can be elastic and nuanced and also stand up for what we believe, and I think that you asked me before, Amber, about the reception of the book, and I think from queer and trans communities in particular, I think the best thing that has happened with this book, which has been amazing to me, because when it was in manuscript, one friend of mine, a gay male friend of mine, is one of my best friends, he said, like, there wasn't enough like queer solidarity in it, because I think in the earlier drafts it was a little like, and still some of this is in there, but it was it has some beef with like queers policing other queers. So I think it was weighted a little more heavily. Maybe I was ranting a little bit now and then. So I think it was good. That was good to hear. But I think the point was that, like, oh my God, what was the point? The point was that, like, what was inspiring about going around was that I think so many people told me was that it was precisely the feeling that you could have solidarity, within difference or within nuance or within, that they felt after reading the book that felt hopeful to them, as opposed to this feeling like, because really, I don't think any of us, when we go out, I just went to DC for the Women's March last Saturday, and it was so amazing for so many reasons, but you don't, individual identities are, when you have 400,000 people with different signs, they all become something. It doesn't matter if they emanate from individual causes or identities. They all become something together. So I don't think people have to be, I don't think people have to worry about taking up like a cause or a side. I think we can see that we're part of a much broader fellowship, which is made of us all together. I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but.
I'm usually this person running with the mic. Mm-hmm. So nice to be sitting.
Hi. I one element of your book that really struck me is towards the end, with your discussion around parenting and parenting as kind of an act of everyday labor, that often the experience of being parented is to kind of lose these acts. And I don't know, I think that resonated with me, and especially with what you're talking about the challenges of writing around happiness. I find as myself as a parent, discussing, kind of transmitting my everyday life is really difficult to place into words with folks who aren't experiencing that. I was curious about that aspect of the book, and that what there's been conversation or responses that you've had or thoughts you've had having written
Do you
about
mean
that.
kind of like the Winnicottian line where he says, like speaking in the script of the child or the baby, he says, you know, I forget you, but you remember me to the parent, which I just think is so beautiful, because I think about that all the time, you know, because you remember so many things from your childhood as if you were alone, and like probably there was an eye on you, but you but you forgot it, you know what I mean? I think. I mean, I've actually written about things in my that I've described as being alone, and my family's read them and been like, "We were right there," you know. So I know it's true. But I mean, I'm curious to hear more about what you mean about like transmitting the day, like as a parent for you, like transmitting the day, like transmitting. What did you say? Transmitting the daily.
I think just the daily experience of being with a child,
Yeah.
and letting that move your life is just I find that to be a very unique experience, and
Yeah.
I think I've resonated with what you're talking about, the experience of writing about happiness being maybe
Yeah.
a difficult thing to transmit to someone
Yeah.
else. The experience of kind of being in this very one-sided relationship where you're doing a
Yeah.
ton of labor.
I don't know if it's still in here. I think it is. I think that there was I think it was longer at one point, but I think there was a rant against this woman who wrote a piece in the New York Times on Mother's Day. It was like a cover article, and it said like, you ever wonder why there's like no good writing about, being a mother, because it's boring and no one wants to hear about it, but again, like when I read it, I was like, well, I'll take that as a challenge, and I think that there's this, there's so many incrustations that we, like, that to me, I don't think that they're truths, but they're things that people tell each other, like, oh, you can't write well about motherhood, or like, oh, we've heard too many of X story before. Like, there are all these things people say, and like, they're so not rooted in fact. Like, any piece of good writing immediately blows them out of the water. So I think part of what's really hard as a writer is getting all those voices out of your head, so that, like if I'm writing a book like Bluets, which centers around heartbreak, I'm not going, oh, why does the world need another book about a woman wronged who, liked a bad person? Like, I mean, like that, you're just never going to go to work, on what you need to do. You just have to stay kind of sentence by sentence on it. But I think that parenting produces that kind of challenge in living, and in writing. But the last thing I'll say on that is just that to me, this was also kind of an important book in that I had written several books that, as most, autobiographers do, and as I know as a teacher, I read many, many of these that are very harsh on their parents and really take them to task for all the ways they ruined your life. And I think that one of the hardest parts of this book for me was kind of staging a reckoning with my mother and perhaps my stepfather, showing all the different kind of childish rages that I still harbor. And I mean, it sounds so cheesy, but of course, understanding as a parent that, I mean, as somebody once said to me, like, once you realize that as a mom, especially in our culture, that everything you do is wrong, you're really freed up, because you're like, like when people will be like, how can you write about your kids? You think that's ethical? And I'm like, anything I would have done would have been wrong. So that's fine. I'm not saying it's not like carte blanche, but you just realize how quickly people want to make something wrong. So I think that it was, it was not lost upon me in writing that I was writing about all these many mothers of my heart, but not my own mother, like not giving her credit for actually being my mother. And so the book to me had to kind of move to that as one of its revelations for me as a writer.
Hi. I have a half-formed question that I hope you'll entertain.
I'm wondering if you could speak to your a queer perspective or provide one on the relationship between birthing a text and birthing a child. I feel like that kind of extends from what's already being said. And if we can somehow, or if you can somehow also connect that to the problematic biologism that underlines and mines a lot of trans exclusive radical feminist spaces.
It's not half-formed, it's just big. Yeah, I mean, I'm not like writing a book is like having a baby kind of a gal, you know. I mean, I think that one of the gifts of queer kinship studies, or or experience, is, we were just talking about this earlier, is your aliveness. A really profound aliveness to all the ways that there can be care and attention, not running along biological ties, either in a family space or in a, extended community or in an art community, or in many ways, So I think in that way, I'm not sure how I put it in the book. It's like I'm talking about Steiner's Show Puppies and Babies, and I talk about the way that, like, childbearing can be like under the umbrella of queer kinship rather than the reverse or something like that. But I think that it's one of the the last line of this book, which I kind of wrestled with because it was a little cheesy, but it ends by saying I don't know, something like the sound of our care, it's ongoing song. And I think that song of care, it doesn't, we associate it with the feminized, or we associate with these different things with care, but care to me is also caring about aesthetics or writing a good book, or what I mean. It doesn't have to just be familial or caretaking per se. So I think in that way, I think of books as great acts of attention, which sometimes take you away from your care relationships, which is one of their complexities. And I don't know. The other question about biologism and trans-exclusive stuff is, I don't know. I think I'm going to pause on that because I don't quite know how to connect it to the former, but I'll think about it for a minute.
Also usually carrying a mic around a classroom. I was interested in when you were talking about using yourself as a guinea pig in the editing process. And you seem to sort of be touching on like this idea of the relationship and the role of the body in your writing. And I was just wondering if you could expand more on that, because I feel like that's something that maybe isn't always addressed, say like in a creative writing learning environment, or I'm just really interested in your thoughts about that. And I don't know if you watched Jill Soloway's talk on the female gaze, but she was describing sort of her cinematographer's role on set and the role of embodiment in their creative process, and it just sounded like what you were describing was somewhat similar.
Yeah, I mean, the guinea pig quote, I was kind of cribbing it from Hervé Goubert, who's one of my favorite writers, and he once said, well, Paul Preciado uses this as an epigraph for Testo Junkie, for those of you who read it, but, Goubert says, when I write, I'm both the scientist and the rat he slits open for his research, and I think that like that kind of dual mentality of both being the slit open rat, I'm sorry, this is kind of yucky, but like, and the scientist doing the examination is really interesting to me, and I think that I've long been interested in a kind of post-shame or like post-confessional model of autobiography that looks at, that doesn't kind of enforce a like what's private life, what's public life, but is more about what our embodied experiences tell us about the culture that we live in. And I think that there's a lot of work, especially in kind of critical race studies or in books like Claudia Rankine Citizen and stuff, that have been, that have made, I think, really interesting efforts, especially in kind of writing and thinking that she's done about Black women and health in particular, and about the ways in which racism or aggressions are somatized, and I think it's that kind of interplay between our culture and the way that we somatize being a part of it. To me, is much more interesting than conversations about like, you're writing so personal. Like it's like the wrong swirl of terms or something. When there's this other, I think, really much more interesting swirl of terms somewhere else. So I think, I've kind of talked about this before in different venues, but I think. I think embodiment in writing can be a lot of things. Like it can be writing literally about the body, but it can also be just. Like I was kind of describing before, an increased or sustained attention to how writing acts upon the physical body when you read, like when you, as a reader and as a writer. And I think like I was saying before about kind of the role of instinct or hearing your words back to you and using yourself again as kind of a guinea pig. Like you have to get enough distance from your writing to like hear how it sounds, And I think that's the trick of being. You could make that the scientist and the rat. You could make it the writer and editor part. You can make it whatever kind of split you want. But I think you can even do it not a biography, but like in this book I wrote, The Art of Cruelty. It was really about kind of using myself again as like a guinea pig, like thinking of all these very intense works. Like, what did I feel like when I first saw Ana Mendieta's like rape piece or something? Like, what did it? And then trying to. Through my embodied experience, come up with some critical judgments, not just tell like how I felt, but kind of also realizing that if art works on the senses, if it is in fact, like Jacques Rancière has written a kind of like a kind of, if its modus operandi is to increase what we actually literally can apprehend sensorially. By having new experiences, then it's really critical to understand as a critic or reader how we are imbibing and reacting to stimulus, if that makes sense,
I believe there's a question directly behind you.
Thanks, Amber. I related to Amber's incredible blazer, like color matching. I wanted to know how you felt about the cover of this book and whether that was something that was in line with the text. Like, I don't know how much sort of relationship you have to the design of your books, or like what that pinkness felt like to be attached to your text, if that works, and like having such a relationship with color in your previous books. Like, what's pink with you?
I'm into it. I kind of thought about the cover myself, like in terms of the kind of lettering I wanted. I mean, it's really, I was really, Grey Wolf was so wonderful with this book in so many ways, but one way that they were really wonderful is that, and we were talking about this earlier, but so many people, so many publishers want to shovel, your book to like, the Argonauts, the story of my queer family making, it's like, and it's like, I always hate that. Like I always want the title to just like do the work and be the thing. And so I think that the fact that they just let that be the case and with was great. And the pink, it's kind of it's trendy colors right now, but it's also very 90s colors because of ACT UP, which was and like Lesbian Adventures and stuff, who were all my people when I was coming up. We're the same age, so Amber's go. But and I think since this book is kind of embarrassingly an homage, let's just face it, to a lot of 90s theory that I was exposed to. Somebody I read with the other day said, "I love how you're not afraid to date yourself with the theory that you read." I was like, people still read Foucault, man, they do. Yeah, man, there was a lot of Audre Lorde signs at the march. Come on, man. But I felt like but that was okay with me to date it in that way. I think because especially right now in the States, it's been a while since I thought about the ACT UP years and the heavy AIDS years and the kind of activism and repetitive actions and repetitive being in the streets and the high stakes of people dying at such high rates and the sense of invention, urgent invention in activism and innovations in activism that had to be developed in a very short period of time and under a lot of pressure. And, I think we're in that situation right now. So I think, the past is never the past. So I'm down with the cover.
I love the cover too because it looks like a spray stencil, like a guerrilla spray stencil that, in the 90s perhaps I would have stenciled all over the streets. Yeah. So I'm a Virgo, and being a Virgo, we have time for one more question. And I am seeing one in the back. It looks like that's where the mic is headed. Yeah.
Hi. So I was accepted into CalArts, and I really wanted to study with you, but I wasn't. I couldn't get the money together, and I was just wondering, how do you deal with that? I don't know if you like. I feel like sometimes we perpetrate the systems that oppress us. So, what is your relationship to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a totally excellent point, and that I think that student debt and working as I do and what we refer to in the business as a high touch, high cost program, meaning is it's antiquated, it's dysfunctional, it's unethical. I mean, I don't think it's unethical. I think it's unethical. I mean, I think all graduate and non-graduate education should be free. So I think I don't think, kind of back to the binary decisions, of all the work that I could do in the world, I don't feel badly about teaching in higher education, even though I'm disgusted by the tuition structure, such as it is, because I think that, days spent with students reading and writing and making art and talking about them are the world that I want to live in and that they want to live in, and that we have to find ways to replicate them that don't participate in the kind of odious systems of student debt that I think are sinking by design. I don't mean at CalArts in particular by design. I just mean as I don't know how it's like in Canada. I'm sure you guys are doing much better here, but. Anyway, so I think that, I fight within my own environment for student funding tooth and nail, and I teach at an art school, and art schools are notoriously difficult because they don't tend to have the endowment structures that university system does in the United States. So they are kind of, they're like the giraffe amongst a herd of elephants in terms of how they're structured, but I'm very, I'm acutely aware because I direct my program and talk to people like you all the time, and we're about to do admission season again. I'm acutely aware of the ethical pinch of trying to convince people to come to a program that they feel like, might not be the best economic decision for them. I've never met anybody who was sorry that they went to my or other, I don't know other programs, but so that makes me feel good. But, it's something to work to change for sure,
I'm going to tail it. So, I'm going to tail it. I'm going to ask you one more.
Okay, good.
So I've heard you in several interviews and also seen you as a panelist and a speaker talk about writing as a problem you need to solve or an obsession that needs your attention. So what's your problem? What's your obsession right now? Is it fair to ask you what's a little glimpse of what you might be working on next?
I have this book I've been working on before the Argonauts that I was working on. It's a more critical endeavor, so it'll vastly disappoint anybody who wants to know the next chapter of my familial life. But don't all, I'm sure you're all not stampeding to know. But I have to say that, right now is a hard moment because politics are kind of galloping ahead. And since the project that I have been working on is a very hydra-headed project that's loosely arranged around the questions of freedom, emancipation, and liberation, kind of what I did around cruelty and the art of cruelty, because I'm very transfixed by how the United States, and probably here to some extent, but I think more in the United States because of its history of chattel slavery, you have, two highly developed discourses about freedom. One, a kind of white settler notion of freedom as something that you have and that no one can, you have to fight people off who are trying to take you if they want to take it from you, and then the other as the utterly never yet arrived, endlessly obstructed, promised land to be free, stemming from, slavery through, civil rights and through incarceration movements. So I think, and I think that those two differing discourses. I mean, I've always been really interested in, Wittgenstein's probably my favorite philosopher, and this passage where he talks about, I kind of use this as the basis for the Blue Book, but when he talks about, when I say blue and when I say I'm in pain, or if I say I believe in God, like, how do we know that we're talking about the same things? Like, how do we know when we both say God, how do we know that the referent of our language is fixed? And of course it isn't, right? So I'm very interested in the way in which, in the United States at any rate, the freedom is endlessly sold, but the word means has two deeply distinct histories that I think are still in combat, obviously. So I was writing a lot about that in different ways, taking me through really interesting wormholes into chapters about female drug addiction and other really interesting things. But I think that right now, like I said, it's a little hard in that, I'm kind of letting politics gallop a little bit right now and trying to see, it's interesting to live in history, right? Like we all do, and to see, this book, it feels really dated to me now, and that's fine because all writing is dated to when it was. But, I think that it's really interesting to see how the concerns in it about homonormativity and about like, if queers get all their rights, like, what's going to be radical about us? Like, those are not the questions that people I know are talking about right now. And it hasn't been that long. They were talking about them 4 months ago, So I think it's really interesting. And sometimes as a writer, I think you just have to hang back for a minute and kind of let things happen for a little while. And then, but I'll keep working on it,
So as you know, there is going to be a book signing afterwards. But before we even think about getting out our books or purchasing books from independent bookseller, Pulp Fiction, let's please give Maggie Nelson a warm round of applause.